Well, hello APUSHers, this is Mr. Rains, and in today's video, we are going to be looking at Period 4, 1800 to 1848, from Jefferson to Jackson. Now that's a lot of ground to cover. Are you ready? Well then let's get started. For our story of significance for Period 4, we're going to be looking at Andrew Jackson. A controversial figure in American history for sure, Andrew Jackson often appears on the AP exam, so he's a good one to know. Jackson was born into poverty, but would later become a soldier, then a wealthy Tennessee lawyer, and then a fierce young politician. His leadership in the War of 1812 earned Jackson national fame as a military hero. Well, after narrowly losing to John Quincy Adams in the contentious 1824 presidential election, Jackson would return 4 years later to win redemption and establish a new party, the Democratic Party. Old Hickory was his nickname, and he would fight against the National Bank. He would end the nullification crisis in the South, and infamously moved the Native Americans west, a moment known to us as the Trail of Tears. Well, now let's look at Roman numeral 1, a new party leads. As you might remember, President Washington claimed no political party, but he tended to side with Hamilton, a Federalist. Following Washington came Adams, who certainly embraced the Federalist Party and ideas. Thomas Jefferson, however, was the known leader of the opposing party, the Democratic Republicans. The election of 1800 was a clash to determine which of these two parties would lead our nation. Adams looked for re-election in a race against Thomas Jefferson. In the end, Jefferson would be elected the third president of the United States. This election is often referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because a new party was taking the lead. What is most typical in other countries is that when a party change takes place, it is done in a violent way. However, in 1800, we see a peaceful transfer of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. This ushered in a time period, though, sometimes referred to as a period of Jeffersonian democracy. Rather than finding support from the big cities as the Federalists had always done, Jefferson appealed to the common man, as he called it, the average American. Keep in mind, still at this point, only white, property-owning males could vote. Jefferson took action that demonstrated a new party was now in control. He worked to remove all internal taxes, most notably the hated tax on whiskey. It was essentially a tax-free America under Jefferson. Second, he worked to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, which had limited immigration and freedom of speech and the press. The differences between the two parties are highlighted in the election of 1800, as indicated in this illustration. The goals of the Jefferson presidency included an attempt to mend divisions that politics had caused. Remember, even Washington had warned against political divisions. In his famous inaugural address, President Jefferson said, "We are now all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He wanted to unite the country once again. Jefferson also promised to stick to the words of the Constitution when making decisions as president. Remember, this was one of the things he had opposed Hamilton on. We will find, though, that Jefferson struggles to adhere to this principle himself once he's in office. Finally, Jefferson vowed to stay out of foreign conflicts. Unfortunately, this too will prove more difficult for President Jefferson than he had thought. Roman numeral 2, Marbury versus Madison, a famous Supreme Court decision. This case will have long-lasting impacts on our developing country. James Marbury had been chosen as a federal judge by the exiting president, John Adams. Marbury then claimed that he had a right to this position based on law. So when President Jefferson, the new president, refused him the position, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court did something it had never done before. The court ruled that the law which Marbury claimed gave him a right to this position was actually unconstitutional. But much more significantly than this case and Marbury himself, Marbury versus Madison establishes the concept of judicial review. Judicial review claims that the Supreme Court has the sole power to rule that any law is or isn't constitutional. And it has been used many times since this case to do just that, on issues as diverse as slavery to education and health care. Roman numeral III, inconsistent as president. Now, President Jefferson had made some lofty promises, but won't be able to faithfully keep those promises once he is now president. The first test came with foreign policy. When Muslim Barbary pirates in Tripoli demanded that American sailors give them a bribe to travel the Mediterranean, Jefferson approves the use of military force. But even more notably than that is what Jefferson would do with a major land purchase. The vast land west of the United States was known as the Louisiana Territory, and it was owned by France and Napoleon. When presented with a real estate deal of a lifetime, President Jefferson will purchase the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. Now, this purchase will double the size of the United States, increasing our country's size and arguably power. Jefferson also saw this land purchase as a means to get rid of another problem, the Native Americans. The fulfillment of that dream won't come until later under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, which we'll also discuss in Period 4. But for Jefferson, the Louisiana Territory purchase posed an incredible dilemma, because nowhere in the Constitution did it permit a president to make such a purchase. As you should remember, Jefferson was so insistent on a literal, strict interpretation of the Constitution. Putting aside his concerns, though, Jefferson made the purchase, and he believed that the benefits far outweighed his promises. Here's a map that shows you the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Again, another inconsistency will present itself in the Jefferson presidency. As Washington and Adams had faced troubles on the high sea, Jefferson will as well. Not only Britain, but France continued to interfere with our trading ships and implemented a practice known as impressments, where they would capture American sailors. But rather than go to war this time, or even attempt another treaty, President Jefferson takes a bold action, and he will sign the Embargo Act into law. This new law forbade any American ship from leaving for a foreign port, basically cutting off all trade. Of course, this would prevent our ships from being attacked, but it would have devastating impacts on the U.S. economy. Not only that, but the law itself certainly demonstrated an increase in power to the national government, something that Jefferson himself had always opposed. Remember, he believed in a weaker national government and a strong state government. Roman numeral IV is more foreign conflicts. Since really the presidency of Washington, the United States struggled with establishing itself on the world stage. The constant barrage of attacks at sea and the devastating Embargo Act was now the responsibility of a new president, James Madison. And James Madison was torn on how to handle this conflict. Madison would end up signing the Non-Intercourse Act, which narrowed the Embargo Act against only France and Britain, and opened up the doors for trade once again, which would improve our economy. But this wasn't enough for the war hawks. These were aggressive Congress members who felt that the United States needed to declare war against England to defend our rights at sea. The two most notable war hawks in Congress were John Calhoun and Henry Clay. In the end, the war hawks got their way, and the United States would once again face Britain in war. This war would be called the War of 1812. But were their motivations pure? Some doubt it and claim that the real motivation for war against Britain was that these war hawks were actually land hungry for Canada, and this would be an opportunity to gain land from Britain that we had not received following the Revolutionary War. Another speculation was that a declaration of war gave the United States Army full authorization to engage in violent attacks against troublesome Native Americans. Madison was a Democratic Republican, and most of the support for this war came from that party. But the opposing party, the Federalists, adamantly were against this war. You may remember from our discussion in Period 3, the Federalists desired a strong alliance with Britain, so this certainly would make sense that they would oppose this war. The War of 1812 could be considered the rematch from the Revolutionary War, and this time the U.S. would not have the help from France. The most notable incident in the war was when the British marched into Washington, D.C., and burned down many federal buildings. The First Lady, Dolly Madison, stayed behind and saved numerous artifacts from the White House, including the famous portrait of George Washington, before she herself escaped in the nick of time. The British burned the White House and moved from there into Fort McHenry in Maryland. This is where a famous battle took place, and Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer, would watch the battle take place, and there he wrote down a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, about the bombs bursting in the air, and yet our flag was still there. The poem would later become the United States national anthem, but I'm sure few people know it was about the War of 1812. Here, the original Star-Spangled Flag at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. You can see it's pretty battered. The War of 1812 would end with the Treaty of Ghent. Not much would be accomplished in this war or treaty. The U.S. does not gain Canada, and the British continue to harass American shipping. But a long-term significance from this war is the fact that the United States would never fight the British again in war. Today we know that the U.S. and Great Britain are great allies. The War of 1812 had become a contentious issue among the political parties at the time. As we mentioned, the Federalists adamantly opposed involvement in this war. They saw this war as a greedy means to gain territory of Canada, and they even called it Mr. Madison's War. The Federalists then in New England decided they must meet together at what became known as the Hartford Convention. They were opposed to the war and wanted to present their complaints to the President himself. Some at this meeting even discussed the possibility of secession, meaning separating from the country over this one issue. When they had finished their meetings, the war was already over, and they were seen as unpatriotic, and some even said the Federalists were treasonous for even considering the possibility of secession. The Hartford Convention marks the death of the Federalist Party and the beginning of a period of basically one-party rule, the Democratic Republicans. Roman numeral 5 is the era of good feelings. The time period following the War of 1812 is known as that, the era of good feelings. Well, what would make this period so good? Well, there was a spirit of nationalism during this time period, where Americans were proud to be Americans. For the first time, literature and art was more American-centered, and there was an effort to rebuild the capital city to be bigger and better than it had ever been before. And this would be a period where one party, Like I said, the Democratic Republicans dominated control of our government. Here is an illustration of the rebuilding of the Capitol building after the War of 1812. Roman numeral 6, not so good feelings. The era of good feelings is really a misnomer, as there is never really a period in history where all is good. And this, of course, is no exception. The Panic of 1819 was the first major peacetime financial crisis in the United States. It was followed by a general collapse of the American economy that persisted through 1821. But even more concerning was the growing sectionalism that was developing in the country. Though Americans were certainly proud of their country, they were equally as proud of their particular region of the country. And the differences between the North and South will eventually spill over into conflicts. The issue of slavery most notably divided the North and South. Following the War of 1812, there were 11 free states, meaning slavery was outlawed, and 11 slave states, meaning slavery was permitted in those states. This meant that power in Congress was equally divided, and not one region had an unfair advantage. However, when the territory of Missouri petitioned for statehood as a slave state, a fierce debate ensued. This state could potentially upset the balance of power. To avoid a war over this issue, spoiler alert, that's going to happen anyway, but to try to avoid war, Henry Clay suggested the Missouri Compromise. To keep the peace, Congress orchestrated a two-part compromise, granting Missouri's request to be a slave state, but also admitting another territory, Maine, as a free state. This compromise also passed a law that drew an imaginary line across the former Louisiana Territory at the 3630 North Parallel Line, establishing a boundary between the free and slave regions. The Missouri Compromise was criticized by many Southerners because it established a principle that Congress could make laws regarding slavery, which had always been a state issue. But at least the Missouri Compromise resolved the slave issue temporarily. Another important concept would develop during this period as well, this one regarding foreign policy. President Monroe made a bold proclamation when he said in a speech that the American continents are therefore not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. This became known as the Monroe Doctrine, a cornerstone of American foreign policy. It was essentially a threat to European powers to stay out of the Americas. The Missouri Question. Northerners were against adding Missouri to the Union as a slave state because it would disrupt the balance of power in Congress between the slave and free states. But Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state when Maine was admitted as a free state. In this cartoon, Uncle Sam, the symbol of the United States, is making it clear that the Americas were off limits for further colonization. This is an illustration of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Roman numeral 7, building up America. Remember, the era of good feelings was a time period where America began to develop as a nation. We became more self-centered, you could say. The famous congressman, Henry Clay, is credited with a lot in American history. Clay envisioned a diversified American economy in which agricultural interests and manufacturers would exist side by side. Essentially, he saw beyond the argument of whether the U.S. would be an industrial country or an agricultural one. It could be both, according to Henry Clay. To achieve a successful economy, Clay argued that we needed to focus on American products, not foreign products. One of his most well-known ideas is known today as the American system. Seems logical since this is a time period focusing on American interest. Part of his American system included imposing protective tariffs. Tariffs? What are those, you might ask? Well, a tariff is a tax added onto goods imported into our country. But why would he want to put a tax on imported goods? Well, tariffs are taxes that are intended to increase the cost of foreign imports so it is less competitive against the same type of product made in the USA. Then, people would want to purchase more products made in our country, helping American businesses to succeed. When the U.S. levies a tariff on something, it is the U.S. importer who pays the tariff, not the foreign exporter. A tariff is a border tax on the buyer, not the seller. Tariffs make it more expensive for a buyer to import a good into our country from another country. Well, the second part of his economic plan was to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States. You might remember this had been a controversial issue between Hamilton and Jefferson. But Clay argued that the bank was essential to provide easy credit for Americans. Finally, he argued that the federal government needed to begin funding transportation systems, including roads and canals, to connect Americans. The argument, of course, was, does the federal government actually have the right to do this, or should this be left up to the states? But, in the end, this was Clay's American system. Protective tariffs, so Americans buy American goods. Easy credit, so Americans had money to spend, helping to grow the economy. And transportation systems which could connect markets and Americans in different regions. Some other accomplishments during the era of good feelings included the Rush-Bagot Treaty. The United States and Britain established border agreements between the United States and Canada. Ultimately, the U.S.-Canada border would become the world's longest unfortified border. It was during the War of 1812 that Andrew Jackson made a name for himself. But following the war, Andrew Jackson's actions were equally as significant for American history. Jackson led an unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818, and he put the U.S. in a predicament with Spain. However, rather than pursue war with the Spanish agreed to sell us Florida in the Adams-Onis Treaty, also known as the Florida Purchase Treaty. So during the era of good feelings, we are really establishing ourselves and our borders. Roman numeral 8 is Faith Leads to Reforms. In period 2, we discuss the impact of the First Great Awakening on society and on our founding fathers. However, the Second Great Awakening would arguably have an even bigger impact on American history. Christians across the country began hosting outdoor church services known as camp meetings to spread the faith and the Christian influence. What was unique about many of these meetings was the fact that minorities and women were often present and sometimes encouraged to speak, sing, participate. Not only that, but many sermons were focused on how Christians should take an active role in pushing for reforms in our society. Therefore, the Second Great Awakening marks the beginning of major social reforms. These reforms are often known as the antebellum reforms, or before the Civil War, including women's rights, abolition, temperance. Some characteristics of the Second Great Awakening are the feminization of religion. Not only were more women in attendance than men on most occasions, but often the women were the most active, most prominent in these camp meeting services. It is argued that this showed some progress for women's rights with their ability to participate in such a way in these religious events. Here is an illustration of a camp meeting service. These were outdoors and often emotional events. In this illustration, You can note that many women are in attendance and intermingled with the men. This would certainly be a stark contrast to what we had seen in Puritan religious services. Roman numeral 9, antebellum reforms. Now, let's look a little deeper at some of these reform movements that came out of the Second Great Awakening. Christian theology began to encourage people to take action in society, to push for social changes. And one of those first movements was prison reform. Often, American prisons were neglected, and prisoners faced inhumane conditions. Dorothy Dix was a social reformer who visited American prisons, and she would document exactly what she saw there. What upset Dorothy the most was the fact that mentally ill were placed in prisons rather than in mental health facilities. Not only that, in some of the prisons that she visited, she noted that orphans were placed in cells with violent criminals. So Dorothy Dix would petition state governments, including the Massachusetts legislature, to make changes to clean up America's prisons. And by 1835, America was considered to have two of the best prisons in the world. They were located in Pennsylvania. Astonishingly, reformers from Europe looked to our new nation as a model for building and improving their own prison systems. Advocates for prisoners believed that criminals could change their behavior and they could learn in prison how to become good citizens once released. So rather than punishment, they looked for ways to rehabilitate prisoners so that they could adjust to society outside of the prison. An even larger movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening was the temperance movement. The movement's ranks were mostly filled with women who, with their children, had endured the effects of unbridled drinking by their husbands and fathers. Alcohol was blamed for many of society's problems, among them health problems and crime. Eventually, the temperance movement will split along two lines, between moderates who would allow some drinking and radicals that demanded total prohibition. And this would lead to a long road to prohibition. The third antebellum reform is education. Horace Mann is one of the most notable reformers in education in America. Horace Mann argued that a common school was necessary, that it would be free and available to anyone, funded by the government. He believed that these public common schools would be the best means of achieving the moral and socio-economic uplift of all Americans. This is a famous cartoon known as The Drunkard's Progress. The author insinuates that one drink will lead to a life of poverty, criminal activity, and ultimately suicide and the destruction of a family. Another cartoon says that drinking leads to the neglect of duty, moral degradation, and crime. Horace Mann, one historian, said, "No one did more than he to establish in the minds of the American people the conception that education should be universal and free, and that its aims should be social efficiency, civic virtue, and character, rather than mere learning." Dorothy Dix. The sick and insane of Massachusetts are confined in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, beaten with rods, lashed into obedience. She would push for reforms, including, as the picture indicates, places for the mentally ill to be treated. At the time, these places would be known as lunatic asylums. Today, of course, we know them as mental health facilities. Here's another practice stimulus-based multiple choice question. This one is based off of an excerpt from Dorothy Dix. And it says, the efforts in the excerpt above can be best understood in the context of, well, you should have selected C, attempts to match democratic political ideals with social realities. As the United States was claiming to be a free society that honors individual rights, we began to see the areas where we were were falling short. The fourth antebellum reform is a big one, and that is the feminist movement. The influence of the Great Awakening and the new educational opportunities available to girls and young women enabled white middle-class women to leave their homes, joining and forming societies dedicated to reform. Women were the ones leading the charge for temperance, prison reform, and even abolition. During this period, women were trying to figure out what their role really was in society. You might remember Republican motherhood claimed that women were the guardians of virtue and the spiritual heads of their home. So women were expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, and to pass these virtues on to their children. Women were, of course, unable to vote. Men would gain legal control over their wives' property, and women with children had no legal rights over their offspring. Additionally, women could not initiate divorce, make wills, or sign contracts. Women effectively held the legal status of children. However, white women entered the public arena through their activism in these charitable and reform organizations. But these women would face a great deal of opposition. The popular belief known as the cult of domesticity claimed that a woman's proper sphere was in the home, not out in society, that it was the man's job to make important decisions for the family and for society. According to the cult of domesticity, true women were to hold the four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. Well, how did these women begin a movement in America? Well, many people point to a very specific event. American women reformers were invited to attend an anti-slavery conference in London. These women were well prepared to give speeches, as they had been accustomed to doing in America. However, when they arrived at the conference, they were told that this was a meeting for men only and not appropriate for women. They were permitted to stay, but to sit behind a curtain and listen only to the proceedings. Angry, these reformers felt that instead of fighting for abolition, they needed to go back home and form a movement to fight for women's rights. One of the leaders of this movement was a lady named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she would become one of the founders of the women's movement in America. The very first women's rights convention in America would take place at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. The result of the Seneca Falls Convention was the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled exactly on the Declaration of Independence in order to emphasize the belief that women's rights were part of the same democratic promises on which the United States was founded. The Declaration of Sentiments outlined 15 grievances and 11 resolutions designed to promote women's access to civil rights in America. The Declaration would begin with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." 68 women and 32 men, all of who were already involved in some aspect of reform, signed these Declaration of Sentiments. One of their demands included suffrage, or the right to vote. However, these feminists would not get the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. In a weird irony of history, the location of the Seneca Falls meeting is now a laundromat. Here is a portion of the Declaration of Sentiments, the part that shows all men and women are created equal. Here are just a few of the grievances of the women at the Seneca Falls meeting. Next, we have the Transcendentalist movement. Admittedly, this one doesn't quite fit with the others. Transcendentalism has its roots in American Christianity, though. In the 1830s, a liberal Christian movement arose that went against the spiritual teachings of the Second Great Awakening, including against miracles. These liberal Christians claimed that instead of miracles, Christ should be believed and followed based on his moral teachings alone. So in that way, this was really a counter-response to the Second Great Awakening rather than an extension of it. At its core, Transcendentalism celebrated the divine equality of everyone, that everyone was equal, that there was no division between saved and damned, for everyone could have a transcendentalist experience outside of religion. The movement, though, would begin to overlap with antebellum efforts towards social reform. For if all men and women were spiritually equal from birth, they all deserved to be treated equally, and so they would fight for social and political equality for all. Other transcendentalists moved even further toward what we would recognize today as socialism. These transcendentalists claimed that the evils of society were due to the evils of capitalism and greed, that America was pushing people to work hard in unsafe conditions just for a profit, ignoring their real spiritual needs. Brook Farm was a utopian community, an attempt to live in a society where people shared everything, where there was no barriers between the rich and poor, and a community that divided profits according to socialist principles. The most famous of this movement was a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson would claim that focusing on work and profit only killed our spirit, and we should connect with nature instead and our inner being. This is a poem, Song of Myself, a transcendentalist poem that celebrates the self and nature. Schools of art, like the Hudson River School, depicted the beauty of nature and can easily be connected with the transcendentalist movement. Like I mentioned, Brook Farm was a utopian community started by transcendentalists who agreed to live together and share all profits. A socialist attempt. Roman numeral 6, the abolition movement. The abolition movement would arguably be the biggest of the antebellum reforms. Slave importation had ended in 1808 as part of the slave trade compromise. However, this would not end slavery in America. In the South, cotton was king, and slavery was so ingrained in their society and economy. In the North, however, a growing abolition movement was forming. These reformers believed that slavery was in opposition to our democratic ideals, that all men are created equal. And slavery certainly did not express American beliefs in liberty. It was actually the opposite of liberty. One of the first abolition groups was the American Colonization Society. These abolitionists hoped to purchase slaves and then to send them back to Africa, not to live in a society with white Americans. However, this was not really a workable solution. Most of those enslaved had been born in America. So had their parents and their grandparents. Going to Africa was not freedom to them because they believed they were Americans. The abolitionist movement, though, to many, is considered radical. This included the face of the abolition movement, William Lloyd Garrison. He was considered radical because in his newspaper he often called slave owners things like murderers and rapists, and he would call for the immediate emancipation of slaves without compromise or agreement. William Lloyd Garrison even believed that our Constitution was actually a pact with hell because our founding fathers had allowed for the growth of slavery. Obviously, Garrison wouldn't win many supporters in the South with this type of language. A more moderate view on the issue of slavery was that of the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers believed that they could slowly extinguish slavery by not allowing it into any new territory. So as the United States would grow and move further and further west, slavery would be outlawed and they hoped would eventually die out. Sometimes abolition literature would make its way down south, even into the hands of slaves. Now, most slaves were illiterate, but some could read. A good example of this is Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a literate slave and a slave preacher. He believed he was called by God to lead the slaves to freedom. And Turner managed to secure arms and horses, and he would enlist about 75 other slaves in an insurrection that resulted in the murder of 51 white people in the South. This incident, the Nat Turner Rebellion, put fear in the hearts of Southerners and resulted in harsher slave laws to punish the slaves, restricting them from any access to learning how to read and write or any ability to leave their plantation to visit another. Here is an illustration of the Nat Turner Rebellion, one of the largest rebellions in American history of slaves. Roman numeral 10 is the pro-slavery response. As abolition movement began to grow, Southerners began to become very defensive of their institution, and they believed they needed slavery to survive. And so they began to defend and justify their actions in what became known as the positive good arguments. Southerners claimed that slavery was essentially good because the slave master was always giving Christianity to the slaves. That meant that these slaves could have eternal life. So the justification for their enslavement and taking away their liberty on earth was eternal life in heaven. Another form of justification was when they would claim that they were providing slaves with their basic needs. Southerners would argue that they treated their slaves good by providing for their shelter, for their food, for their clothing, and all of their basic needs. Ultimately, though, they would argue that slaves and blacks were really an inferior race, that God had created them lower than whites, and therefore they had a right to treat them this way. Obviously, not a very Christian idea of equality. Not only that, but they called Northerners hypocritical, and they would point to the way Northerners would treat their workers. They considered these workers to be wage slaves, because many of the workers that worked in the factories in the North worked in poor conditions, maybe, arguably, by the South, even worse than what they were treating their slaves. The tension between the North and the South became so heated that eventually Congress established the gag rule, which prohibited any discussion on the issue of slavery in an attempt to avoid violent conflicts. Again, this was a way to just sweep the issue of slavery under the rug, to avoid it, to put it off for later. Roman numeral 11 is regional differences. During the antebellum reform, like I mentioned, sectionalism really divided Americans. The regions or sections of the country couldn't be any more different than they were. The North would begin to develop as an industrial center of our country, with the rise of factories and the growth of cities, whereas the West became the nation's breadbasket, dependent upon agriculture as their means of economy and life. The South developed a cash crop economy, most especially dependent upon cotton. Remember, we called this king cotton because it was so ingrained in who they were. Roman numeral 12 is immigration. Now, definitely, immigration had been the heart of America since the colonial period. But the 1840s is notable for its spike in immigration, especially from Germany and Ireland. In the middle half of the 19th century, more than one-half of the population of Ireland immigrated to the United States. So did an equal number of Germans. Over 7.5 million immigrants came to the United States, more than the entire population of the U.S. in the year 1810. But why would they come? Many came for the jobs that the factories offered. Though they didn't pay much, they offered more than these immigrants could ever have received back home. Immigrants would work hard. They would be the ones that build America's canals and constructed our railroads. They became involved in almost every labor-intensive endeavor in our country. Much of the country was built on the backs of immigrants. Many would come for the opportunity of freedom. They would escape religious and political persecutions in their home country, and they saw America as a home for liberty. The Irish potato famine would motivate a lot of people to come. The potato, you might remember, was part of the Columbian Exchange and helped grow Ireland's population. But the potato famine impacted nearly everyone. The new immigrants worked hard for low wages, but they were also the victims of prejudices. Part of the reason for the opposition was religious. All of the Irish and many of the Germans were Roman Catholic, and most Americans at the time were Protestant, and they really saw the Catholics as a threat to their way of life. Part of the opposition, though, was political. Most immigrants living in the cities became Democrats because the party focused on the needs of the common people. But part of the opposition occurred because Americans in low-paying jobs were threatened and sometimes even replaced by these immigrant groups willing to work for almost nothing in order to survive. So because of this, the response was nativism. Nativists were Americans who opposed these new immigrants. Eventually, the nativists would form a political party known as the American Party or the Know Nothing Party. Here shows you the nativist flag where it says, "Beware of foreign influence," which is kind of ironic since all the Americans were at one point immigrants themselves. Roman numeral 13, the Market Revolution. The new transportation projects, plus the rise of factories in the North, led to what we call, in American history, the Market Revolution. Better transportation meant easier movement of people and goods, improved trade, and the North's role as the commercial center of our nation. The Market Revolution meant that America was now connected and could easily travel, buy, and sell. The Erie Canal was an engineering marvel that had dramatic effects on the growth of the economy. It also made canal building very popular, along with the steamboats. Turnpikes, canals, and last but not least, railroads linked the North to the rest of the country. The market was thriving, but the life of factory workers was far from easy or ideal. Conditions were so bad that these workers were often referred to as wage slaves. They worked long hours for low wages in dangerous conditions. The Lowell system was a factory system that employed young girls who worked and lived right on the property. With the Market Revolution, the North and South would become more connected than ever before, but the differences still exist. For example, the South would grow the cotton that was sold to the North and then turned into clothing. But this meant, in a sense, that the North was supporting the slave system of the South. Obviously, the abolitionists were from the North criticizing the slave system, but the North was dependent, in a way, on the same system in which they were criticizing. Workers would eventually try to fight for better pay and working conditions. However, unions would have a difficult start in America. That's because unions were seen as socialist and definitely not part of a capitalist system. Most states outlawed unions, and workers could easily be arrested for going on strike. A notable contribution to the markets was a man named Eli Whitney. His inventions, like the interchangeable parts and the cotton gin, would transform how America does business. More goods were now available, though, and more affordable for the average American during this time period known as the Market Revolution. The Cumberland Road, or National Road, is a good example of new transportation systems during the Market Revolution. This is a drawing of the man-made Erie Canal. The Erie Canal allowed for someone to essentially travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes by boat. Eli Whitney's cotton gin encouraged many to grow more cotton, but it continued the institution of slavery. Textile mills were often built near a river, and the moving water provided for the energy. Here is a photo of a mill girl, possibly part of the Lowell system. During this time period, unions were often outlawed, and there were no child labor laws. Here's a picture of another mill girl, obviously without shoes on. Roman numeral 14 is a contested election. The election of 1824 is a notable one in American history. Remember, during the era of good feelings, there was essentially one political party, the Democratic Republicans? Well, during this election, 5 candidates from that party ran for the presidency. The top 2 contenders were John Quincy Adams, the son of a former president, and Andrew Jackson, the war hero from the War of 1812. The slogan of the time said that John Quincy Adams can write and Andrew Jackson can fight, which was a good picture of their personalities. Since neither of the candidates won a majority of the electoral votes, the election was too close to call and went to the House of Representatives to decide. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, the highest position in the House, was Henry Clay. It is said that Henry Clay met privately with John Quincy Adams, and many claim that they possibly made a corrupt bargain or secret deal. That if Henry Clay persuaded the House of Representatives to vote for John Adams, then Clay would be selected as the Secretary of State under the Adams presidency. This is one of the most powerful positions in the executive branch. In the end, that is exactly what happened, and Adams was selected president. But to the American people, there were questions about the legitimacy of Adams' presidency. So, Andrew Jackson, in response, formed a separate political party, a new party known as the Democratic Party. Because of this, this election marks the end of the era of good feelings. This map shows the election results by state. The corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay would haunt this presidency. Jackson claimed the election had been stolen from him. As pictured here, the carpet is being pulled from under him. Roman numeral 15, birth of a populist president. The election of 1828 to many was seen as the rematch between Adams and Jackson. This election was defined by the personal attacks and smears. Adams was called an elitist, that he was out of touch with the American people, born into politics. And Jackson's character was called into question. He was called violent, drunk. And the truth is, he had been involved in numerous violent duels, and his attacks against Native Americans were well known. However, this time Jackson would win in a landslide. His support came from the South and West, which would be strongholds of the Democratic Party through the Civil War. The major issues that defined the presidency of Andrew Jackson were nullification, bank war, and Indian removal. In class, we discussed what we felt was the most important qualities in a president and compared those to Adams and Jackson. Here shows you an illustration. Jackson, as a young boy, lived through the Revolutionary War, and he refused to shine the boots of a British soldier. Jackson was violent at times, as shown in this illustration of one of his duels. Jackson often claimed he represented the common man. Here he is being sworn in as president. Yet Jackson was actually very rich, as shown in this picture of his home, the Hermitage. Andrew Jackson's presidency is defined as Jacksonian democracy. Earlier we mentioned Jeffersonian democracy, and we're going to compare both of those. Jackson would fight for the expansion of the franchise, which means the right to vote. He wanted it to include more people, and under his presidency, nearly all white men could vote, except for in the state of Rhode Island. Some like to compare Jefferson to Jackson because of their many similarities. Both of them appealed to the common man. However, this would definitely not include minorities, as both owned slaves and both favored Indian removal. However, both believed in states' rights. But we will see with Jackson, he's going to be presented with a dilemma on this very issue. But both Jefferson and Jackson were strongly against the National Bank, and President Jackson will be the one that kills the national bank. But unlike Jefferson, who had a peaceful transfer of power and wanted to mend the wounds of the two parties, Jackson would institute the spoils system. He came in and fired all those who worked for the previous president and hired his friends and supporters. Jackson believed that all men are qualified for office. Roman numeral 16 is the nullification crisis. You might remember the idea of nullification was first suggested as a way to get states to ignore the Alien and Sedition Acts. That was in period 3. Well, Jackson supported states' rights, but as president it became a little more complicated. Tariffs, you might remember, were taxes that would incentivize people to buy American products and not foreign ones. However, Southerners opposed, and they felt like this was a means to get them to buy more expensive goods made in the North. Remember, the sectional divisions between the North and South caused much of the conflict. Many Southerners called this the Tariff of Abominations, and Vice President John C. Calhoun, Vice President and resident of the state of South Carolina, suggested that his state use the concept of nullification to ignore the tariff. Jackson, remember, supports states' rights in theory, but that was when he wasn't president. Now he saw this, the idea of nullification, as an attack against him personally and his authority. He threatened to invade South Carolina with the force bill and to force them to pay. He even threatened to find John C. Calhoun and hang him by the nearest tree. However, a compromise was reached by none other than Henry Clay, who was able to lower the cost of the tariff and temporarily calm the tensions between the president and the state of South Carolina. Roman numeral 17 is the bank war. To Jackson and the Democrats, the bank symbolized greed and corruption. This was an institution not in the Constitution and not chosen by the American people. Because of this, Jackson called the national bank the fourth branch of the government. And he didn't say that in a good way. When Congress proposed a bill to renew the charter on this bank, Jackson vetoed the bill, essentially killing the Bank of the United States. He had done what Jefferson had not been able to do. However, the result of these actions caused the economy to be in a tailspin. Inflation spread, and the value of the American dollar went down. Roman numeral 18, and our last Roman numeral, is Indian removal. Native Americans had been an obstacle to Americans since colonial times. Disease, war, treaties, relocation became the story of Native Americans. Another effort by the United States government included Indian assimilation. This was an attempt to strip the natives of their original culture and make them instead adopt American culture. And many tribes did just that in order to survive, including the Cherokees. Many Cherokees became Christians. They adopted American farming lifestyles, and they won many treaties of recognition. 5 other tribes were also classified as civilized tribes by the American government because they had assimilated and agreed to do the things that the American government insisted upon. However, when the Georgia farmland became desirable by Americans, Americans began to intrude on the Cherokee land. Rather than fight in a violent way, which the Cherokees knew they would likely lose, the Cherokees addressed this concern the way they felt Americans might, through the courts. They brought a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court called Worcester versus Georgia. In this famous Supreme Court case, the court actually sided with the Cherokee Indians, claiming it was their land and that the Americans had no right to intrude on it. However, President Jackson had little taste for Native Americans and responded to the court by stating this: John Marshall, who is the Chief Justice of the court, he has made his decision, now let him enforce it. But as you know, it is not the job of the courts to enforce the law. It is the job of the executive branch, the president, to enforce the law. Yet Jackson was blatantly defying checks and balances as intended by the Founding Fathers. In addition, Jackson would actually sign the Indian Removal Act, which would force the Indians from their land, which was rightfully theirs, through treaties and Supreme Court decisions. The Cherokee trip from Georgia to their reservation became known as the Trail of Tears, as many died along this trip. And this marks a dark blot on our country's history. Only the Seminoles in Florida were able to resist this attempt to move them. Opponents then of Jackson began to call him King Jackson. That is because he did things unlike any president prior to him. Jackson used his veto power more than any previous president, and they saw this as another attempt to undermine checks and balances. Not only that, we saw that he challenged the Supreme Court and would not enforce a decision, which is the job of the presidency. And not only that, to many, he was seen as a bully, as you saw with the nullification crisis, threatening to invade the state of South Carolina. This map shows the removal of Native Americans, and this famous illustration of the Trail of Tears is seen in many high school textbooks. It is the sad trip of the Cherokee Indians onto their reservation. Well, we've come to the end of Period 4. It is the longest one by far. I hope you've enjoyed the video, that it's helped you, that you've learned a lot, but be sure to come back for Period 5. I'll see you soon.